I'm Diane Dean. I'm an acrylic artist, and this is my studio in Art Mob Studios and Marketplace in downtown Hendersonville. I have prepared a brief video that includes demonstrations of how I go about building the texture on my canvases, and I'll show some of the steps in my entire painting process. I'll also spend a little bit of time talking about the commission process. I do a lot of custom pieces for my customers, and I'll show how that process works. So the first step in my process, I start with my blank canvas. This is a stretched canvas on a wood frame. It's called a gallery wrap canvas. And I use this acrylic gesso, which is a very heavy-bodied acrylic material. It's white. And I use palette knives to do a surface texture on my canvas. A lot of the design that I do is really just free-form carving. So it's really kind of a sculpting, excuse me, a sculpting process. I work pretty quickly. This material stays wet for a while, and it's very heavy, so it doesn't really slump off the canvas. I press different objects into the surface. I'm going to use some wire mesh on this one. This is actually a piece of gutter guard. It's a nice weave, and it gives me this little design in the surface. I'll pull the material out, and then I kind of carve around it to just give it some kind of a more organic feel. The whole sculpture on the surface of the canvas really just has to stand on its own as an abstract design. This piece will be a field of poppies when I get it finished, and I'll just continue working over the surface until I feel like everything has a sense of balance and movement. In my process after the texture surface has dried is to work with a background. This is a textured canvas that I painted black. I am not doing a video of that because it's not terribly interesting to just watch a canvas be painted black, but now you begin to see the texture kind of showing through the colors. The next step for this piece, which will be a field of poppies, I do a lot of poppy fields. I'll have my colors basically loosely painted in for the background. I'm going to do a lot of kind of dripping and dry brushing. I'm using fluid acrylics. When I do the floral elements on here, I'll actually be using my heavy-bodied acrylics that are in jars. I use flat brushes and I use mop brushes to do the background. I've got some of my favorites here. I'll work with a wee bit of water just to give these fluids, which are already pretty loose, they'll make them even looser so that they'll actually drip and run down the canvas. So it's always a little scary when you do the first brush stroke on the canvas, but I have the opportunity to do quite a few different layers of color. So I just sort of start working and look at the texture and just kind of get a feel for how the paints are going to flow over the surface. It'll take quite a few layers. I usually leave a little bit of the black showing in the background. I think what I'll do is just work in this little section over here so you can get a sense of how the different layers build on top of each other. So it's starting to take form where you see even more of the texture. These are basically my primary colors. I have a very limited palette. I don't even own any green paint. All of my greens are a combination of my Indian yellow and my ultramarine blue. I'll do a little bit of light green for in here. And I'm just, again, that came out a little more yellow than green. We'll throw a little bit of blue in there. And then I'm going to use some of my quinacridone, which is this nice golden hue. So I'm really looking for a background that looks kind of organic. And just brings out the texture. When I get to a certain point, my easel moves up and down. It's a counterbalance with weights easels, and I'll be sliding it up and down. At this point, I'm just really kind of doing a wet and wet and some dry brush work where I'm just sort of wiping what's left on the brushes off. I also will want to do some pretty significant dripping as I get through with the background, and I'll add a little bit more water in when I'm doing that kind of a process. And this is when I start to do the pieces that begin to look more like my flower leaves and stems. So I continue to just build this background until I feel like I've got something that's going to work as a backdrop for whatever floral elements I'm going to put on the canvas. So the next step in my process, once I have done my background, this is a sunflower painting. For this particular style of painting, I do the texture on the surface like I did when I texturized that first canvas. You can see where the wire mesh was and some of the ridges that I've carved into the surface. Rather than paint these black in the background, these I work forward from the white surface. So I've used my fluid acrylics, just like I did on the black canvas, to basically design this surface, which is a very organic, fluid, kind of wet and wet background that looks like the foliage of the flowers. Now I'm going to start with my heavy-bodied acrylics. Different from my fluids, the heavy-bodied acrylics are very sturdy and will hold the shape that I give them with the palette knife. So I'm going to begin on my sunflowers, and I'm just going to put probably 3 of them similar to what I did there. I'll start with a little section that I'll use as my center just to keep me kind of lined up. I'll go back in and do some more texture on that later, but that just gives me kind of a target to shoot for. I usually wait for that to dry a wee bit, but I'm going to go ahead and work with it now. Sometimes I sketch the flowers on the canvas, especially if it's a bigger canvas, but in this case I'm just going to put a few flowers on it. So I pretty much can just start with my paint. And I'm just really going to freeform palette knife in some of these petals. I'm using multiple colors. In this case I'm only using 1 yellow, and I'll mix a little white with it. It is picking up a little bit of my, my surface color there, but that's okay. Because in nature these petals will all be a little variated in color anyway. So I'll go about working with the palette knife until I have enough petals on this flower. I'm doing the one side at this point, and then I'll start to work around on the bottom half that will kind of come up over it. But it's a pretty straightforward process. The secret is really using good heavy-bodied acrylics that really hold up to this palette knife work, keep their form. After these colors dry, I'll go back with brushes. You can see some of the variation of color that you see in the other piece. So I will go back with brushes and use some of my fluid acrylics. This is a piece that a customer saw that's complete, and it's greens and blues and beige. The customer has 2 very busy chairs that are sitting in front of their fireplace. This is actually the fabric in the chair. So what I had the customer do was go to Home Depot and pick out color swatches that matched all of the different areas in their chair and bring those to me so I could work those colors into the background of the painting. So essentially I'm reproducing something that's similar. The flowers are never in exactly the same place and there's always variations in the texture, but I was able to work the purples and the reds and the golds and the blues into the background. This piece isn't finished yet. The next step for me is to put all of the stems connecting the flowers to the rest of the composition, and then it will be done. Thank you for watching this video today, and if you have any questions about my work or anything else here at Art Mob, this is Michelle Sparks. She's the owner of Art Mob Studio and Marketplace, and she'd be happy to help you.